The air in the barren training range was thick with silence, broken only by the distant rustle of wind dragging dust across the cracked earth. Rows of veteran sharpshooters stood along the observation line, their eyes fixed on the endless expanse of desert where the steel silhouette target had been placed, 3,700 meters away, barely visible to the naked eye. Most of them had spent decades behind scopes, fighting in wars that never made the headlines, and each one carried the quiet arrogance of men who believed they had seen it all. But today, all eyes weren't on the target. They were on him, the newcomer. The kid really? Lean, quiet, barely in his 20s, dressed in a plain uniform without the weight of medals or patches that decorated the veterans around him. His name was Arslan Kale, though few had bothered to remember it. To them, he was simply the rookie who didn't belong here, not in the company of legends. Arslan carried with him a weapon that looked more like a cannon than a rifle. The Snipex Alligator. A massive, beastly anti-material rifle built in Ukraine, designed to punch through armored vehicles and fortifications. Its sheer length and brutal recoil were enough to humble the strongest shooters, and yet the newcomer carried it as if it were an extension of himself. The men muttered quietly among themselves as he adjusted the bipod and settled into the prone position, his movements slow, deliberate, without a trace of nerves. One of the older snipers, Captain Dresnik, spat into the dust and shook his head. Kid won't even hit dirt at this range. He'll break his collarbone before the round even clears the chamber. A low chuckle rippled through the line. It was the kind of laugh born of certainty, the laugh of men who had buried too many rookies with big dreams and no discipline. But Arslan wasn't listening. He had spent months preparing for this day silently, obsessively. Every night, when others slept, he had studied wind charts, thermal drifts, ballistic curves. He had memorized the subtle hum of the alligator's mechanics until it was as familiar to him as his own breathing. He was no stranger to distance. Growing up in the high ridges of Balavik, where the mountains stretched like jagged spines into the sky, he had hunted deer across valleys where a mistake meant not just missing a meal but plunging to his death. The rifle had come to him not as a tool of war but as a test of will, and the desert was just another ridge to conquer. He pressed his cheek against the stock, his eye slipping into the massive scope that magnified the distant target until it was just a pale shimmer in the haze. The wind whispered differently here, shifting in invisible rivers, tugging at the round before it even left the barrel. He steadied his breath, slow and deep, until his pulse no longer thundered in his ears. The world contracted into silence. The laughter faded. The desert flattened into stillness. It was just him and the shot. He ran the calculations in his head like prayers. Elevation adjustment, 72 MOA. Wind drift, 9.4 mils. Coriolis effect accounted for. The earth itself spun beneath the trajectory of his round, and he had bent that reality into numbers he trusted more than faith. Behind him, one of the instructors barked impatiently, "Any time today, rookie." But Arslan didn't rush. He let the rhythm of his heartbeat guide him. His finger hovered lightly over the trigger, feeling the tension like the string of a bow. At that moment, his mind slipped back to his father, the man who had taught him how to line a target through iron sights when he was just a boy. His father's voice had been steady like the mountains, "Patience. The shot isn't yours. It belongs to time. Borrow it and return it clean." The alligator roared. The ground beneath him shook as if the earth itself had been struck. The sound rolled across the desert in a deep, thunderous echo that rattled the bones of every man standing behind him. Dust exploded upward from the muzzle brake, swallowing him in a storm of grit and fire. Through the scope, Arslan never flinched. He followed the vapor trail as the massive 14.5 by 114 mm round cut across the sky, carving through distance that humbled ordinary rifles. It was like watching a streak of steel light race against the horizon, disappearing into the shimmer of heat that guarded the target. A pause stretched, heavy and eternal. For a heartbeat, it seemed impossible, too far, too ambitious, a fool's attempt. Then the sound came back. A metallic clang, sharp and undeniable, carried faintly across the desert. The target, a thick steel silhouette, shuddered under the impact, leaning back as if struck by the hammer of a god. A white scar bloomed at its center, clean and perfect, right where a man's heart would have been. The line of veterans fell silent. Mouths that had curled with laughter now hung open, robbed of words. Captain Dresnik's cigarette slipped from his lips, forgotten, and burned into the dirt. No one moved. No one breathed. It was as if they had all just witnessed something unnatural, something that defied the rules they had lived by for years. Arslan calmly lifted his head from the scope, his face unreadable, not triumphant but serene. He didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He simply slid the rifle's bolt back with a clean, mechanical motion and ejected the smoking casing, letting it fall into the sand with a faint hiss. The silence broke with a single voice. 3,700 meters, one of the spotters whispered, his voice trembling. Dead center. The words spread like fire through the ranks, repeated in disbelief, each man needing to hear it again to convince himself it was real. They had trained for years, fought in wars, chased impossible shots across killing fields, and none of them had ever seen a hit like that. Not at that range. Not on the first attempt. Arslan stood, dust clinging to his uniform, the rifle towering in his hands like some ancient weapon too powerful for the present age. He glanced once at the horizon, then turned away, leaving the veterans behind him in stunned silence. The desert swallowed his footsteps, but the echo of his shot lingered in the air, a thunder that no man among them would ever forget. The echo of that single shot refused to die, even as the desert settled back into its oppressive silence. Dust swirled lazily in the heat, carrying with it the metallic tang of gunpowder that still clung to the air. The veterans remained frozen, their pride and certainty fractured in an instant, as though the bullet had torn through more than just steel. It had punctured years of hierarchy, experience, and unshakable confidence. Some tried to compose themselves, clearing their throats or adjusting their rifles as if to remind the world they were still soldiers. But the truth was already carved into the steel target nearly 4 kilometers away. The rookie had done the impossible and nothing could erase it. Arslan, however, did not bask in the astonishment. He moved with quiet purpose, folding the bipod and hoisting the Alligator with practiced ease, the rifle's weight seeming lighter in his hands than it had any right to be. His face was calm, unassuming, betraying none of the storm he carried inside. The instructors watched him closely now, their earlier scorn replaced by something harder, sharper, scrutiny mixed with a shade of fear. They had seen men hit long shots before, but never like this, never on a first attempt, never with such stillness in execution. Captain Dresnik finally found his voice, rough and edged with disbelief. Luck, he muttered, spitting again, though this time it didn't carry the same disdain. 1 in a million shot. Don't mistake it for skill. His words fell flat, swallowed by the doubt etched on every face around him. Even Dresnik's own eyes betrayed him, flickering toward the target with a look that spoke louder than his denial. The range master, Colonel Vaynar, stepped forward, his boots grinding into the sand with the authority of a man who had seen enough wars to know when history was being made. He was a stern figure, his face carved from stone, his silver hair cropped short, his reputation unshakable. But even he had to pause before addressing the newcomer, as if searching for words fitting of what had just occurred. His gaze locked onto Arslan, weighing him not as a soldier but as something else entirely. Repeat it, Vaynar commanded, his tone low, steady, testing. Another round. Same distance. The crowd stirred. A single miracle could be dismissed. 2 in a row? That would forge legend. Arslan gave a single nod, not out of arrogance but obedience, and lowered himself back into the dirt. He handled the Alligator with the same precision as before, chambering another massive 14.5 millimeters round that glinted dully in the sun. The casing alone looked heavy enough to bruise a man's palm, but in his hands it slid into place like it belonged there. The world seemed to hold its breath again. Spotters adjusted their scopes. Veterans leaned forward, their skepticism fraying under the pull of curiosity. Arslan's body became still, his breathing once more reduced to the slow rhythm of the earth itself. Through his scope, the target shimmered faintly in the heat haze, as distant and unreal as a ghost. The wind had shifted now, subtle but treacherous, pulling in crosscurrents that even seasoned marksmen would hesitate to challenge. Yet his fingers adjusted dials and turrets with unshakable confidence, translating chaos into order, uncertainty into mathematics. He waited. Seconds stretched into eternity. Even the desert seemed to bow to the tension, the wind itself falling quiet as though unwilling to interfere with destiny. When he squeezed the trigger, the Alligator roared once more, its thunder rolling across the range and rattling through the veteran's bones. The casing flew free, spinning in the air before landing with a hiss in the sand. The vapor trail streaked across the sky, trembling as it was dragged by invisible hands of wind, wobbling like a line of fire straining against the pull of the world. For a heartbeat, even Arslan wondered if it would miss, if this shot would betray him and restore order to the world of men. But then the sound returned. Clang. The steel shuddered again, the mark striking less than a palm's width from the first, a twin scar that burned bright in the sun. Gasps erupted. Some cursed under their breath. Dresnik's face paled as though the blood had been drained from it, and for the first time in decades, his hands trembled. The line of veterans broke into whispers, disbelief twisting into reluctant awe. This was no accident. No trick of chance. This was mastery raw and undeniable, a skill that seemed almost supernatural. Colonel Vaynar stepped closer, his voice dropping to something reverent. "Who taught you?" he asked, not as an officer, but as a man needing to understand. Arslan rose to his feet once more, dust clinging to his knees, the alligator cradled against his shoulder like an old friend. His eyes, dark and steady, met the colonel's without flinching. "My father," he said simply. His voice was calm, but there was weight in those words, a story untold that pressed heavy against the silence. He offered no further explanation, and none dared demand one. It was enough to know that the knowledge he carried was born not in academies or battlefields but in places beyond their reach, passed down like an heirloom forged in fire and patience. For the first time in their careers, the veterans standing there felt the ground shift beneath them. They were masters of distance, warriors of precision, yet they were staring at something they could not match. It was as though the mountains themselves had walked into their ranks and reminded them of their mortality. Arslan Kale was no longer the rookie. He was something else. Something they did not yet have words for. And as the sun dipped lower on the horizon, painting the desert in shades of blood and gold, Colonel Vaynar turned to the instructors and spoke quietly, but with conviction that silenced even the wind. "We're looking at the future," he said. "And God help whoever stands on the other side of his scope." That night the camp was quieter than usual, though no one truly slept. The desert wind rattled the canvas of tents and whispered through the barracks, but it wasn't the weather that kept men awake. It was the memory of two impossible shots echoing in their skulls. Conversations carried in hushed voices over mess tables and under dim lantern light, veterans speaking not of past battles but of the rookie who had stolen the air from their lungs. Some dismissed it still, muttering about luck, chance or even faulty steel on the target. But others, those who had seen too much to believe in coincidences, spoke of Arslan Kale with a reverence usually reserved for legends of old. His name had already left the range and slipped into rumor, and by dawn it would travel far beyond the desert. Arslan himself sat apart from the others, perched on a flat rock just beyond the barracks, his rifle dismantled across his lap. The alligator's components gleamed under the pale wash of moonlight as he ran a cloth over the barrel, checking every detail with the same meticulous care he had shown when making the shot. His face was unreadable, not prideful, not burdened with arrogance. To him it wasn't glory, it was discipline. The rifle was not a weapon of awe, not in his eyes. It was a responsibility heavy as the mountains where he had been raised. He had grown up with that weight pressing on him since the moment his father first placed an old hunting rifle in his hands. His father's name had been Kale Renar, a man whose face was carved by wind and sun, whose eyes seemed to see through mist, snow, and distance. In their mountain village, Renar was both hunter and guardian, the one who fed families through harsh winters when prey was scarce. But to young Arslan he was more than that. He was a giant who could hold still for hours, patient as stone, waiting for a single shot to feed a household. "The land is cruel," Renar had told him once, crouched beside him as they watched a stag move across the ridge. "But the rifle makes a pact with it. One bullet, one life. Waste it and you disrespect both." Arslan had carried those words into every trigger pull since. Renar was gone now, lost to an avalanche when Arslan was just 16. The mountains had claimed him as they claimed so many men, burying him beneath ice and silence. That loss had hollowed Arslan, but it had also forged him. In the years that followed, he trained alone, his father's old rifle his only companion, pushing himself beyond reason. Where others saw ridges too far to aim across, he saw puzzles to solve. He studied wind patterns by watching the sway of grass, the flight of hawks, the drift of snow. He carved ranges into his memory until distance itself became familiar terrain. By the time the recruiters came to his village, Arslan's reputation was already whispered about in the valleys. He was the boy who never missed. Now in the desert camp he could almost hear his father's voice in the wind, steady and unyielding, "Patience. Time gives you the shot, not skill." He closed his eyes briefly, letting the words anchor him before reassembling the rifle with smooth, practiced motions. Each piece clicked back into place with mechanical certainty until the alligator once more became whole, gleaming like some ancient beast ready to wake. Meanwhile, in the command tent at the heart of the camp, the senior officers sat in a tense circle, their faces lit by the flickering glow of a single lamp. Colonel Vaynar stood at the head of the table, his hands pressed flat against a map of the region, but his thoughts were far from the grid lines and markings. "You all saw it," he said, his voice carrying the weight of authority. "This boy isn't a fluke. He's a weapon." The others shifted uncomfortably. Major Brint, a man with a thick beard and a reputation for skepticism, leaned forward. "Weapons can be built, trained, refined. This was different. I've trained snipers for 20 years and no one makes shots like that out of the gate. Either he's cheating physics or," he trailed off unable to finish. "Or he's something we've never seen before," Vaynar finished for him, his eyes dark and thoughtful. "And that makes him dangerous. Not just to our enemies, but to us if we don't control it." The word control hung in the air like smoke. The military had long valued precision shooters, but a man who could bend distance itself? That was something new. Something that could change wars. And men who could change wars rarely remained soldiers. They became symbols, and symbols were harder to command. Captain Dresnik sat in the corner, his pride still raw and bleeding. He spoke bitterly, his tone dripping with resentment. "He's a boy with a cannon, nothing more. Give him time and the world will break him like it breaks everyone else. You'll see." Yet even he could not look Vaynar in the eye as he spoke, for deep down, the memory of those perfect strikes haunted him. The colonel silenced the room with a raised hand. "We will test him again. Push him. If his skill holds under pressure, then we'll know what we have. Until then, keep your tongues quiet. The fewer who know, the better." His gaze swept across them, hard as stone. "If word spreads too far, others will come looking. And they'll want him for themselves." Outside, unaware of the debate raging over his future, Arslan laid the rifle across his knees and gazed toward the horizon. The desert stretched endless and quiet, but he felt the weight of eyes on him, the kind of attention that could not be shrugged off. He had not come here to be legend. He had come to serve, to honor the memory of his father, to carry forward the discipline that had been carved into his bones. Yet already he could feel the tide shifting, dragging him into currents he had not chosen. In the silence of the night, he whispered a single promise to the stars above. "I won't let them turn me into something I'm not." But even as he spoke it, the echo of his father's lesson tangled with the colonel's words, and he wondered if such a choice would remain his to make. The desert sun rose like a molten blade the next morning, slicing across the horizon with merciless heat. The camp stirred earlier than usual, men muttering as orders crackled through radios and instructors barked commands. Word had spread beyond whispers now. Arslan Kale was being tested again, this time under conditions no man could dismiss as luck. The range was no longer enough. Colonel Vaynar wanted chaos, unpredictability, wind shifts, moving targets, stress designed to break even the best. If Arslan truly possessed what they thought he did, then today would strip away the mystery or confirm it in front of everyone. Veterans gathered in a tight semicircle at the edge of a canyon, their scopes and spotters set on targets scattered across ridges and valleys. Steel silhouettes had been bolted into the rock face at varying distances, some hidden behind jagged outcroppings, others placed in shadows where light played tricks. And unlike before, the targets weren't stationary. Engineers had rigged pulley systems, dragging some silhouettes along tracks to mimic running soldiers or retreating vehicles. The longest shot stretched out to nearly 3,900 meters, at the far rim of the canyon where heat shimmered like a mirage. Arslan was led to the firing position on a rocky plateau overlooking the canyon floor. The alligator rested heavy against his shoulder as he crouched, his expression calm but not careless. The rifle was a beast, its barrel catching the sun like a spear forged for giants, but in his hands it looked natural, almost tame. The veterans watched closely now, no longer laughing, no longer mocking. Even Dresnik, who clung to his bitterness, stood rigid, his jaw clenched, his pride daring the boy to fail. Colonel Vaynar stepped forward, his voice carrying over the canyon. "You will take 6 shots. Each at a different target. Some are moving. Some are obscured. You will not know the order until I call it. You will have seconds to adjust. No second attempts. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir," Arslan replied, his tone steady as though the weight of the moment had no hold on him. The test began. "Target 3, left ridge, moving west." Vaynar barked. Arslan dropped into prone, the alligator biting into the earth as he aligned the scope. The silhouette was a faint blur in the haze, sliding across the ridge like a phantom. His fingers adjusted elevation and windage with speed that startled the spotters. He exhaled, squeezed, and the rifle roared. The round streaked across the canyon, tearing into the moving steel with a violent clang that echoed like thunder. Applause nearly broke, but the veterans bit it back, unwilling to show respect so easily. Target 1, canyon floor, 2,200 meters. The shift was brutal, Downhill, heat waves distorting the view, wind currents unpredictable. Yet Arslan rolled with it, recalculating in his head as naturally as if he were shifting his gaze. The second shot cracked. The steel target shuddered, struck clean in the chest. By the third call, sweat traced down the faces of the veterans more than Arslan's. He was moving fluidly now, like a machine carved from patience and discipline. Targets fell one after another, some obscured by shadows, some gliding across ridges as if daring him to miss. He did not. Each round struck with precision that left no room for debate. When the sixth shot thundered and the farthest silhouette staggered under the impact, silence engulfed the canyon. 6 shots. 6 hits. No hesitation. No error. The silence broke into murmurs, disbelief cracking into awe. Even Dresnik's mouth stayed shut, though his eyes burned with something darker than envy. The boy had not just succeeded. He had shattered the limits they believed in. It wasn't merely accuracy, it was something deeper, something unsettling. Colonel Vaynar's face was unreadable as he approached. He studied Arslan not like a soldier, but like an artifact unearthed from another age. "You didn't miss a single one," he said quietly. Arslan nodded, not with arrogance but acknowledgement. The shots were there to take. Vaynar's gaze sharpened. Most men don't even see them. The officers conferred privately as the soldiers dispersed. Whispers grew louder in the camp now. Some spoke of Arslan with admiration, others with unease. Rumors spread. Was he gifted, cursed, or simply inhumanly disciplined? In the mess hall, voices clashed between veterans who wanted to claim him as proof of their legacy and others who feared he would eclipse them, make their years of service look small. Dresnik drank heavily that night, his pride festering into poison. To him, the boy wasn't just a sniper. He was a threat, one that stripped away decades of blood, sweat, and sacrifice with 2 afternoons of perfection. And in the dark corners of the camp, Dresnik wasn't alone. A few older sharpshooters, men who had built reputations on impossible shots, shared his resentment. To them, Arslan wasn't a miracle, he was a humiliation. And humiliation in soldiers who lived by pride often grew into dangerous thoughts. Arslan meanwhile kept to himself. He maintained his rifle, ate quietly, and avoided the storm gathering around his name. But he could feel it now, the weight of stares, the whispers when he passed, the way silence followed him into rooms. He wasn't naive. He knew what men did when they felt outshined. His father had warned him once, sitting by a fire in the mountains, "A perfect shot doesn't just strike your prey. It strikes envy in every man who sees it. And envy has sharper teeth than wolves." That night, as he cleaned the Alligator under the pale glow of lantern light, Arslan wondered how long he could remain a soldier before becoming something else entirely, an idol, a target, or a weapon owned not by himself, but by others. The camp was no longer the same after the canyon test. What had once been a fraternity of hardened sharpshooters became fractured into 2 camps, those who whispered Arslan's name with admiration, and those who spat it out like a curse. At meal times, conversations fell silent when he entered, then picked up again in low mutters as soon as he passed. Spotters who had once laughed at his quiet demeanor now leaned closer to him during drills, hungry to learn how he read wind and distance with such precision. But others, men like Captain Dresnik, sat with jaws clenched, eyes dark, drinking bitterness like water. A hierarchy carefully built on years of battle scars and reputation was crumbling, and at its center stood the rookie with the Alligator. Colonel Vaynar, though, saw something beyond petty rivalry. In his private reports he described Arslan not as a promising soldier, but as a strategic asset, an anomaly who could change the shape of warfare. Within days, sealed communications began moving between the camp and command headquarters, detailing the tests, the results, the impossible consistency of the newcomer. The responses that came back were laced with urgency. They wanted more. They wanted to see the boy under real conditions in the chaos of live combat, where no controlled range or instructor's bark could shield him from reality. Orders were drafted. Arslan Kale would be attached to a forward unit within weeks. The news spread through the camp like wildfire. Some scoffed, insisting the boy would crack the moment bullets flew in return. Others grudgingly admitted he might thrive. Dresnik, however, saw it as the final insult. "They'll build him a throne before long," he muttered one night, nursing a glass of cheap liquor. Around him sat a handful of veterans who shared his resentment. Men who had lost friends in faraway wars, men whose best shots had once been celebrated until this boy erased them with casual precision. Together they drank and stewed, their voices low, their pride curdling into talk that slithered close to treachery. Meanwhile, Arslan remained apart from it all. He continued his rituals, cleaning the rifle with near-spiritual precision, practicing his breathing drills, memorizing wind patterns across the desert at different times of day. When others were gambling in tents or brawling over insults, he sat alone on the ridges, watching the horizon as though it were a teacher speaking in riddles only he could hear. He wasn't oblivious to the stares or the whispers. He felt them heavy as storm clouds. But he had grown up with silence, with suspicion from villagers who thought the boy who never missed was unnatural. He knew how to live with envy pressing at his back. Still, the unease in the camp grew more dangerous each day. A week after the canyon test, during a routine weapons inspection, Arslan found that one of his rifle's firing pins had been filed down. Not enough to be obvious but enough to fail under stress. He fixed it without comment, his face unreadable but inside, a quiet confirmation solidified. Someone wanted him to fall, not against an enemy but against his own weapon. He told no one, not even Vaynar. To admit it would be to expose weakness, and weakness in the camp was blood in the water. That night, he dreamed of the mountains again, his father's voice guiding him through the snow, steady and patient. Wolves don't strike the strongest prey. They circle the one they think is alone. When he woke, his jaw was set with new resolve. He was not alone, not as long as he carried the alligator, not as long as his father's lessons echoed in his veins. But he knew now, the battle wasn't just in the ranges or future battlefields. It was here, among men who wore the same uniform, men who should have been his brothers. Colonel Vaynar noticed the change in him. During one briefing, he studied Arslan's posture, the tightness in his shoulders, the way his eyes scanned the room with quiet calculation. "You're aware of the tension, aren't you?" the colonel asked after dismissing the others. Arslan didn't flinch. "It's like wind, sir. You can feel it even if you don't see it." Vaynar's jaw tightened. "Let me worry about the politics. You keep doing what you do best." But even as he spoke, he knew politics weren't something he could shield the boy from forever. Word had already reached higher command that foreign intelligence agencies were sniffing around, their ears pricked for rumors of a marksman who could bend distance to his will. Men like Arslan didn't remain secrets for long. Back in the barracks, Dresnik's bitterness hardened into resolve. The boy had humiliated him once too often. He began speaking openly with a small circle of malcontents, spinning tales about how Arslan's skill was unnatural, a fluke of engineering, even witchcraft. Some laughed it off, but others, those drowning in their own jealousy, listened. They began to whisper of ways to restore order, ways to ensure the rookie's star burned out before it consumed theirs. The stage was being set, though Arslan himself remained unaware of just how deep the resentment had festered. As he lay in his bunk that night, listening to the wind scrape against the walls of the barracks, he thought only of the orders that were soon to come. Deployment. Real combat. The chance to prove himself not against steel and silence, but against enemies who shot back. He did not crave glory nor medals, nor the whispers of men too proud to admit respect. He wanted only to serve with the precision his father had taught him, to show that patience and discipline could turn even chaos into clarity. But in the shadows of the camp, where envy brewed into conspiracy, other men were preparing to test him, not with targets, not with orders, but with betrayal. The orders came at dawn, carried in sealed envelopes stamped with the insignia of high command. Convoy of armored transports was waiting by the edge of camp, dust clouds curling around their steel hulls as engines growled in anticipation. Colonel Vaynar briefed the men in clipped sentences. A hostile militia had fortified a ridgeline overlooking a key supply route, choking off convoys with well-placed machine gun nests and long-range fire. Too many attempts had failed to dislodge them. Now it was their turn. The mission was simple on paper. Neutralize the enemy snipers, clear the ridge for the infantry to advance. Simple but lethal. For Arslan, it was the moment he had been waiting for. No pulleys dragging steel silhouettes, no instructors calling targets, no controlled silence of a firing range. This was war, the test no simulation could prepare a man for. As he settled into the transport with his alligator cradled across his knees, he felt the hum of nerves in his chest, not fear but anticipation. Around him, other snipers checked their rifles, strapped on gear and cast sidelong glances. Some were wary, others resentful. Dresnik sat opposite him, expression tight, muttering to a comrade under his breath. Arslan ignored it. His focus was already drifting beyond the steel walls, toward the ridge where unseen eyes might already be searching for them. The convoy rattled across broken ground for hours before halting in the shadow of a shallow canyon. The ridge loomed above, jagged and sun-baked, its slopes dotted with rocks that offered both cover and peril. The air was heavy with the smell of sand and cordite, a faint reminder of skirmishes that had already bloodied this ground. Vaynar gathered the unit, pointing to a map spread across a hood. Enemy positions here, here and here. Reports place at least 3 long rifles, 2 of them confirmed kills at over 2 kilometers. They're dug in disciplined. We take them out, the infantry moves. If we fail, men die in trucks before they ever see the battlefield. His gaze swept the group before landing briefly on Arslan. We're spread thin. Every shot counts. They moved out in staggered teams, low across the canyon floor, each pair finding vantage points along the ridges. Arslan and his spotter, a wiry veteran named Cade, climbed to a ledge that overlooked nearly the entire slope. Cade glanced at the massive Alligator, then at Arslan. "You ever killed a man before?" he asked, voice flat but not mocking. Arslan adjusted his scope, scanning the rocks. "No." Cade grunted. "Well, first one's the hardest. After that, they don't get easier, just quieter." The first crack of gunfire came minutes later. A bullet screamed over their heads, chewing stone into dust. Enemy sharpshooters had spotted movement on the opposite ridge. The canyon erupted with the sound of rifles, each team exchanging fire across impossible distances. Spotters shouted corrections, veterans fired, and enemy bullets whined back like steel wasps. The chaos was immediate, but in Arslan's scope, the world slowed. Through the shimmering heat, he caught a flicker of movement, an enemy marksman crawling into position behind a boulder nearly 3,000 meters out. Wind tugged hard across the canyon, a cruel cross-current that made the shot improbable at best. Arslan exhaled, reading the dust swirls, the faint bend of dry grass along the slope. His finger curled. The Alligator thundered. The enemy's head snapped back, body folding into the rock before the echo even reached the canyon floor. Cade swore softly. Jesus, one shot. But Arslan was already shifting. A second sniper revealed himself with a muzzle flash higher on the ridge. Arslan adjusted elevation by instinct, fired, and the flash went dark. The veterans around the canyon saw it, their radios bursting with disbelief. 2 enemy sharpshooters down in less than 30 seconds. The ridge was shifting, the enemy suddenly unsure. Still, the fight was far from over. Machine guns spat tracer fire down at the advancing infantry, and RPG trails streaked against the sky. Arslan reloaded with steady hands, his focus unbroken. Where others scanned frantically, he seemed to sense the battlefield breathing, each enemy movement drawn to his eyes. At nearly 3,600 meters, he caught another figure setting up, a heavy rifle balanced on sandbags. The wind howled. The distance was punishing. But to Arslan, it was only numbers, a puzzle waiting to be solved. His shot rang out, and a heartbeat later the sandbags collapsed red. Across the radios, disbelief turned into awe. Veteran snipers who had doubted him now whispered curses of respect, their voices shaking. But not all. Dresnik, positioned on a ridge further south, watched through his scope with clenched teeth as Arslan dismantled the enemy line with surgical precision. Every kill was another nail hammered into the coffin of Dresnik's pride. The ridge was collapsing now. Without their snipers, the militia positions wavered, machine gunners abandoning nests as infantry surged forward. Explosions rolled across the slope as grenades and mortars silenced what little resistance remained. Within the hour, the ridge was theirs. When silence finally settled, broken only by the groans of wounded and the crackle of radios, Arslan lowered his rifle. He had fired fewer than a dozen shots. Each one had struck true. Cade stared at him, shaking his head slowly. "Kid, I don't know what the hell you are, but I've never seen anyone cut through a battlefield like that." Back at the staging ground, the atmosphere was conflicted. The infantry cheered him openly, grateful for the invisible hand that had carved a path through death. But among the snipers the divide deepened. Some clapped his back, unable to deny what they had witnessed. Others turned away, their silence sharper than insults. Dresnik didn't say a word, but the hatred in his eyes was louder than any applause. Colonel Vaynar, however, was quietest of all. He knew the battlefield today had been more than a victory. It had been a revelation. A revelation that would ripple beyond this desert, into the ears of generals, politicians, even foreign powers. And as he studied the young man calmly wiping the dust from his rifle, Vaynar felt the same unease that haunted him since the first test. A weapon like this could change wars, but it could also shatter armies from within. By the time the unit returned to base, Arslan's name had already outpaced them. Word of the ridgeline battle carried faster than any convoy. Infantrymen spoke of him with reverence, commanders cited his shots in their reports, and rumors twisted his feats into myth. Some swore he had fired blind, others claimed he could see through smoke as though it were glass. By the third day, stories of the rookie who carved death at 3 kilometers had spread across neighboring camps. By the end of the week, whispers reached foreign ears, carried through intercepted communications and trembling prisoners. The legend of Arslan Kale was no longer contained. For Arslan himself, nothing felt changed. He ate in silence, cleaned his rifle with the same meticulous patience, and trained with the same rituals that had defined him since childhood. But around him the air had shifted. Soldiers who once ignored him now hovered near, desperate for advice or approval. Spotters lingered like shadows, scribbling notes as if proximity alone could unlock his secret. When he walked past the barracks, heads turned. Some eyes glowed with awe, others with suspicion, and some with naked hostility. Colonel Vaynar saw the fracture deepening. He had witnessed enough campaigns to know that armies could survive bullets, bombs, and starvation, but envy was a poison that killed from within. At night, in his office dimly lit by a single lamp, he drafted reports warning of the risk, not of the enemy beyond the wire, but of the jealousy festering inside his own men. Command's replies were curt, dismissive. Retain him. Protect him. Exploit the asset. To them, Arslan was no longer a soldier. He was a weapon. The veterans felt it too, though in different ways. Some swallowed their pride and adapted, training alongside him in the hope of elevating themselves. Others, like Dresnik, felt every whispered story like a blade twisting in the gut. Each new tale of Arslan's kills drove the captain deeper into resentment. He had spent 20 years earning scars, carving his reputation through blood and grit, only for a boy to eclipse him in weeks. And worse, command adored him for it. Dresnik's bitterness hardened into obsession. In the quiet of his tent, he replayed the Ridge battle again and again, convincing himself that luck, nothing more, had carried Arslan's bullets. It wasn't just allies watching. Foreign operatives took interest, their reports dripping into the intelligence networks like venom. An unknown sniper, barely trained, wielding a weapon capable of kills beyond 3 kilometers, this was something nations could not ignore. Shadows began to stir, agents tasked with learning his face, his habits, his weaknesses. The boy from the mountains had become a target not just of envy but of geopolitics. Arslan felt it in the way strangers looked at him, in the way conversations stopped when he entered a room. He heard the shift in tone, the soft reverence that always carried a knife edge of fear. It reminded him of home, how villagers had once crossed themselves when he walked by, as though he were cursed for his unnatural precision. Only now the stakes were higher. Fear in a village meant isolation. Fear in an army meant danger. Still he did not change. He carried the Alligator to the ranges, fired until his shoulder ached, studied the wind until his eyes burned. But he noticed more, the misplaced gear in his quarters, the strange silence when Dresnik's circle fell quiet at his approach, the subtle glances traded like daggers. Someone was waiting for him to slip, waiting for the myth to falter so they could tear him down. One evening as he returned from the range he found Cade, the wiry spotter who had stood beside him in battle, leaning against the barracks wall. "You know they're circling, don't you?" Cade said without preamble, his voice low. Arslan met his gaze calmly. "Wolves always do." Cade spat in the dust. "You keep making shots like that, they'll circle tighter. Not just our own. The enemy's hunting too. And command? They'll use you until you're dry, then throw your bones to the dogs." For the first time, Arslan let silence stretch. He had always known this was possible, had seen it in the eyes of generals who stared at him like he was a loaded chamber. But hearing it aloud grounded the thought into reality. He nodded once. "Then I'll do what I was taught. Keep breathing. Keep steady. Make every shot count." Cade shook his head, half amused, half worried. "God help us. You're either the calmest bastard alive, or you don't understand what storm you're standing in." That storm was already gathering. Command sent word that Arslan would be deployed again, this time deeper behind enemy lines, to eliminate a high-value target whose movements had been impossible to track. The mission was dangerous enough to border on suicidal, but to the brass it was perfect, a test to see just how far their weapon could reach. Vaynar argued against it, warning that such exposure would place Arslan in crosshairs too large to ignore. His protests were buried under the weight of ambition from men who saw only numbers, range, and power. As Arslan prepared his gear for the mission, the camp's atmosphere thickened with unspoken tension. The infantry cheered him, convinced he was invincible. The veterans muttered, each word dripping with grudging disbelief. Dresnik sharpened his plans in silence, his pride now fully eclipsed by the need to prove the boy mortal. And in distant offices across borders, nameless men studied photographs of Arslan Kale, drawing red circles over his face as they whispered of ways to erase him before his legend grew unstoppable. Arslan sat in his bunk, the alligator resting across his knees. He closed his eyes, recalling his father's lessons, the patient rhythm of breath and stillness in the snow. He was no hero, no myth, no weapon. He was simply a man who had been taught to listen, to wind, to silence, to the quiet voice that told him when to fire. But as the world pressed in, hungry to claim or crush him, he wondered how long that simple truth could survive. The stage was set. Allies who envied him. Enemies who hunted him. Commanders who sought to exploit him. And at the center, the boy from the mountains, holding the alligator like a piece of his own soul, unaware that his next mission would ignite a firestorm no bullet could silence. The night of departure came cold and unforgiving, the desert wind cutting through the camp as though it too sensed the weight of what was coming. Orders had been delivered with the usual steel-clipped precision. Arslan would be inserted with a small reconnaissance team to the far side of the canyon system, where intelligence suggested a warlord was moving under the cover of darkness. The mission was clear: eliminate him before he could regroup his forces. What the orders did not say but everyone felt, was that this was more than a mission. This was a crucible. If Arslan succeeded, his myth would burn brighter than ever. If he failed, his fall would feed those waiting like vultures in the shadows. The team moved out under a moonless sky, their footsteps swallowed by sand. Arslan carried the alligator with the same calm reverence he always had, the rifle's bulk balanced perfectly against his frame. Cade walked with him, the wiry spotter's eyes scanning not just the terrain but the men behind them. Trust was rare out here, and both of them knew betrayal could strike as suddenly as a bullet. By dawn, they were in position on a high plateau overlooking the enemy encampment. Through his scope, Arslan studied the scene below. Tents scattered among rocks, guards moving like ants, the faint glimmer of vehicles hidden beneath camouflaged nets. And then he saw him, the warlord, broad-shouldered and cloaked, striding between his men with the arrogant ease of someone who believed himself untouchable. The distance was staggering, nearly 3,700 meters, farther than any shot in recorded combat history. The wind curled across the canyon in unpredictable currents, shifting dust in chaotic spirals. For most snipers, it was a shot that could not be made.